Hello and welcome back to Skeptics and Seekers. I'm one of your hosts, Dale, representing the Christian or seeker side.
And I'm the other guy, David, the skeptic.
Excellent. And we have a good show for you guys today. So this is going to be the Coherence of Christian Theism, Part 2. So if you remember from months back, I think it was back in January sometime, we did the Coherence of Christian Theism, Part 1. And what we covered there was God as a personal being. So we're discussing God's traditional attributes and whether they are logically coherent, not necessarily whether it's true or something like that, just are they coherent from a logical standpoint. And we discussed what that means. And in terms of God, we're looking at his traditional attributes. So we started with him being a personal being and also being a spiritual being or a disembodied person. That led into my supplemental series on substance dualism and trying to prove that a disembodied person is logically coherent via proving that it's actually true. So what we're going to do this time, it's not going to match our blog. So me and David have sort of agreed to, rather than drawing this out and splitting up, doing three attributes at a time from multiple parts, we'll just get it all done at once. We'll look at all of God's attributes at once for the sake of the audience that might not be interested in hearing it be drawn out and discuss three at a time and that sort of thing. So what I'll do is first, so we'll just describe the other attributes that haven't been covered already in terms of, so the first one is God is not just a personal, spiritual, or disembodied being. He is also omnipresent. So the way I'll define that is he's cognizantly aware of and causally active at every place in space or spatial location. He's also eternal. The Bible makes clear that God is eternal. And rather than get into details, since we're doing everything at once, there are different modes of eternality in terms of how God could be eternal. So the fundamental ones are he could be timeless, or he could be temporal in some way. Either he's temporal just like us, or he's in some hyper dimension of time or something like that. But yeah, I won't get into those details since we're doing everything at once, and just say, yeah, God's eternal, and there are different conceptions of that.
Let me jump in just a little bit here. I know that you're laying out your case, and I usually don't interrupt there, but I don't actually mind getting into some of that. In fact, I don't want to do any pushback right now, but I did want to ask for a clarification on some of these, and so as you were doing them, so that I understand in my own note taking, and so that the Christian understands where you were coming from with these things, because there are different ways of looking at them.
Yes.
And I don't want to prepare a rebuttal based on looking at it in a way that you're not. And so if you would allow me to just ask a question about the spatiality, for instance, of God. So in a way, we are all spaceless in a way. So let me just try to flesh that out, because there is a way of understanding God's spacelessness that may be different from yours. So I am in my apartment. And in fact, I'm in my living room. Now, it is right to say that I am occupying my living room. But even though I am only in my chair in the living room, but I'm occupying the living room. And it's also fair to say, well, I'm in my apartment. Even though there are walls separating me between the living room and the kitchen, my presence goes beyond the place where my butt happens to be sitting. This is part of the language that we use. In fact, as I speak, I'm manipulating airwaves, and in fact, I contributed to what's going on in the kitchen, even though I am in the living room. So you can say I am in my apartment. You can also say I'm in my neighborhood. Or I am in the city of Orange. I am in New Jersey. I am in America. I am in the world. I am in the universe. And so in that sense, I am in this broader sense everywhere. I am a citizen of the universe. I am occupying it right now. Now, so you can say that of God. God is in the universe. Do you mean it that way, or do you mean it in a more specific way that God is consciously present in each individual part of the universe? Do you understand the question that I'm trying to ask?
I think so. So here's what I would say. So God is sort of relates to his omnipresence. So it relates to the universe, sort of like how our soul relates to our bodies in a partially. So our souls are holomerically present in our bodies. God is holomerically present in the universe, and I've defined that as being cognitively aware of every spatial place and causally active. So when I'm saying God, how does that relate to space? So God is not like us. Our souls, they do not have space. God does not have spatial extension. He's like an unextended point. Now that's like us. That's like the human soul related to the body. However, God's different from us in that our souls have a spatial location present where our bodies are. God, I believe, and this is controversial. It's not obvious. I will admit that. Hopefully, the audience will appreciate that. I personally tend towards the position that God is spaceless in the sense that he also doesn't have a spatial location either. Does that answer your?
Well, I think it does, but it leaves me a little bit confused as to what this means. But like I said, I wasn't trying to push back on your idea. I was just trying to understand how you defined it.
Yeah. Well, he's aware of everything that takes place. That's the cognitively aware part.
Okay.
And he's also.
So if I can just define awareness as just something I can understand, like he can see everything. He's not limited by a set of eyes and what's in front of them. He can somehow see everything everywhere at once and understand it all. Is that what you're saying?
If by see you mean it in the biblical anthropomorphic sense, then yeah. But I'm from a technical philosophical standpoint, it's think of his omniscience, like he knows all the true propositions and that sort of thing.
Yes, but if he's aware of me and what I'm doing right now, then and he's aware in all of the ways that a person can be aware, then vision would be a part of that awareness, would it not? I mean, can you say that he's aware of everything I'm doing, but he can't see me?
Yeah, I don't know if God necessarily sees the same way human beings do. He obviously doesn't have eyes, or that sort of thing. So I don't know.
But I would think that he would have something that allows him to see what's going on.
I don't know. Yeah, I'll just take a position of agnosticism on that front. I don't know that we could say he literally sees in some sense, that he has a sensation of sight. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't.
Okay. So once again, let's say if I get on the phone with you, like I am now, essentially,
Mhm.
I am not physically in where you are,
Mhm.
but I am aware, at least in a limited way, of what's going on where you are. So
Oh, shoot.
is
Okay.
that what you're saying, that God is he's aware in that sense, and therefore he's everywhere, because I can kind of turn on the TV and look at 500 channels at once, and then you could say, well, I'm everywhere because I'm aware of some of the things that are going on all over the world.
Yeah, that would be a helpful analogy to see that it's coherent, that someone could be aware of things even when they're not physically present in a
Right.
place.
But I have location.
Yeah, but I'm saying God, yeah, but God doesn't. Location isn't necessary to be cognitively aware of stuff, right? It's sort of related to God's omniscience, which I haven't gotten to yet.
Right.
It's just a way of saying God's omniscient.
That's fine. I'm just clarifying your idea of God's awareness, God's spatiality, and how that might work. So this is serving a purpose, and so I'm going to let it go there. I have a slightly better idea of where you're coming from, but I still find it a little confused, but I'm getting there. So I will let you proceed with your points now. I just needed some clarification there.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. So omnipresence, as I said, he's cognitively aware in a strictly logical sense. Like God, it's just another way of saying God's omniscient. And the other part is he's causally active. He can cause things to happen at every place in space. Okay. So I've covered, and God's eternal. Also, God is necessary. So he's logically necessary or metaphysically.
Before you get to necessary, let me just ask about the causally active.
Okay.
Are there any limits on his causal activity?
Sure.
For instance, I'm causally active, once again using the same example, where you are right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because as I ask questions, I am causing you to react to them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not physically located there, but I'm causally active there.
Yes.
So is that the sense you mean? Now, there are obviously some limits on what I can achieve from here.
Yes.
But I'm still causally active there in some ways. So I have awareness, but it's not as much awareness as if I would have if I were physically there. That's why I was asking earlier, does God have any limitations on
Yeah, these are good questions. And yeah, so in the first sense, causally active, that's in the same way as cognitively aware is related to omniscience, this is related to God's omnipotence. So there are limits based on the definition of what it means for God to be omnipotent. However, there's a difference in the sense that you are cognitively aware through intermediary means. I would say God is causally active in the same way our soul is causally active with our bodies. It's a direct, immediate causation that doesn't take place through intermediary mechanisms. Now, as to how that interactionism takes place, I don't know. As I said in my Substance Dualism Part 4 series, I don't have an exact answer as to how it works with our. It's a direct, immediate cause and effect relation. Although with our soul, that's actually not true, which I didn't say in Part 4, but I wanted to keep it simple because there is the intermediary mechanisms from our brain states causing things to cause my hand to raise. But in the sense that, okay, my soul causes that original physical response, that's what I'm saying. That's a direct, immediate cause and effect. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. So that's
Sure.
what I mean by God is.
Sure, I'll challenge it later. But I just want a clarification for now.
Sure.
All right.
So God is logically necessary as well, or metaphysically necessary. I won't go into too much because I know David doesn't like this, but if you remember my possible world semantics, it's just saying that God exists in every single logically possible world. That seems like a coherent concept to me. So yeah, that I'm saying that's coherent in the same sense. Some mathematicians could say that 1 + 1 = 2 is logically necessary. This is true in every single possible world. So that's what I mean by saying he's logically necessary. It's impossible for God not to exist or to obtain in a possible world. Um, then, okay, so these are going to be additional attributes, just talking off the top of my head, that aren't a part of my blog. So God is also, in terms, immutable. So immutability says that God can't change and that sort of thing. And there are different conceptions as to what that means. No, I take a more dynamic view. So I don't think that God is totally immutable in the same sense that Thomas Aquinas or Catholics might, or my own church is very Calvinistic. That God is just like a timeless block. He doesn't change at all. Um, Everything where the Bible talks about him, in anthropomorphic language or relating to creation, that's not true. It's an anthro somethingism. He's like a four-dimensional block kind of thing in time, and just there's no change. I don't think that's the biblical position. I think that the Bible makes it clear that God is immutable in certain restricted senses. He will never change his character, for example, or yeah, he won't break his promises or and stuff like that. But I do think that God is capable of certain lateral changes. So the reason it's controversial for some Christians to say, no, God has to be totally immutable is because, okay, well, if you're saying God changes in any sense, he's either changing for the better or for the worse. So there's a non-lateral change, and that can't be the case. If God is a maximal great being, a perfect being, there can't be any improvement or diminishment. But I think that there are certain lateral changes that could take place. Um, and yeah, I don't know if examples could be knowledge of certain temporal facts, if you, depending on which theory of time you believe in and that sort of thing. Um, so yeah, that's my position on God being immutable. I think the Bible's only really getting at um, he's immutable in terms of his internal character and this sort of thing. It's not. J.I. Packer gave about a list of 5 different things that God can be said to be immutable for. Now, there's a related attribute called impassibility. And this means basically that God cannot, in response to, God repents. Let's use that. After the flood, he repents. They'll say, oh, no, God can't experience he's not affected emotionally in any negative way by creation. He is totally other. He's not affected by us emotionally in any negative way. That the repentance is just an popathos, I think is the word off the top of my head. So it's in the same way when we say, oh, God has eyes, that's an anthropomorphism. They'll also say, well, when it says God repents, this is just an anthropopathos. It's human empathy and that sort of thing, but it's not real. I reject that position. I think when it says God grieves or God repents or he's angry, that means that he's experiencing the same emotions that human beings, the same negative, no emotions are negative, but the same, from a human perspective, what we consider negative emotions. And he is affected by what we do. When we reject him or sin, this affects God emotionally in terms of evoking these emotional reactions. However, there are obvious differences. When I say God gets angry or jealous, he only does so in a morally perfect way. So he has a righteous anger or a righteous jealousy. Whereas humans, because we're sinful creatures, sometimes, most of the times, and perhaps even all of the time, our motivations, our emotions are tainted by sin. There's a selfish form of jealousy rather than selfless form of jealousy that God always practices. There's a righteous anger. I'm right to get angry at hypocrisy or sin or that sort of thing. Where it gets muddled up is if it's a selfish anger, and it's based on pride. You bruise my ego and that sort of thing, and I'm going to get revenge. Some of the comments from last week, there was some of that going on. I have to admit, I was not always exhibiting a righteous anger in the way God does. So that's that one. God. Okay, God's aseity. So this is to say that God exists a se. He is the creator and sustainer of everything in creation. This relates to everything from physical objects, laws of nature, to abstract propositions, and everything that exists in creation.
I've got a question about the aseity thing.
Okay.
I mean, finish your thought, but that's one that I'd also like to ask before you move on to the next one.
Sure. So there are a myriad of positions, and I just want to say, please, skeptics, if you are intellectually curious, I know you usually aren't about these sorts of things, but even if you just want to learn how to attack Christianity, or for Christians that want to get a good sense on some of these attributes and that. So William Lane Craig has done a defender's class, and I'm going to put in a link to the entire series in the sources in the blog here. It's one of the best out there. I mean, you don't have to read anything if you don't want it. They're just videos, but he's teaching a class, and he goes into exquisite detail describing the different positions on this. He has Q&A from the audience, and the audience asks pretty good questions at times, questions that you guys might be asking yourselves. So yeah, I highly recommend you check out the Doctrine of God, and I'll put the link up from William Lane Craig, his Defender's class. It's really good on this topic especially. So in terms of God's aseity, there are dozens of positions that one can take on this, and this was something I wanted to make sure I do my research on. Obviously, since we're doing it all at once, I'm not prepared to speak off the cuff apart from generalities, but the position that I take is, so I take a realist position with regards to things like, numbers and that sort of thing, but I'm in the mainstream of Christianity. I take a divine conceptualist view. So things exist as thoughts in the mind of God. 1 + 1 = 2 is a thought in the mind of God, and without creation or that sort of thing, physical objects exist as thoughts in the mind of God. This is called a divine conceptualist perspective. So that's my view on divine aseity. Seems coherent to me, but let's see what David's going to ask about it.
I kind of forgot my question now. So I didn't write it down.
Divine aseity, he's the creator, sustainer of everything.
Oh, yes. So by this, do you mean that God sustains things moment by moment, and if he stopped actively sustaining, the universe would fall apart? Or do you mean he sustains things in that he set the laws of the universe in place, and he has in fact stopped activity, and they continue to sustain themselves?
So the former. If God is not actively sustaining the universe, it'll just cease to exist.
Okay, so I thought that's what you might say. So in terms of numbers, which I know that you think are immutable things, but you say they are things that exist in the mind of God, mm-hmm. Are you suggesting that if God stopped thinking the thought that 1 + 1 = 2, that it would stop being 2?
So God can't stop thinking that.
Okay, well, but I know that from your perspective, God can't stop existing, but you were able to answer that question. So in the same spirit of that question, if
well, look,
God stopped
with
thinking that 1 and 1 is 2,
I
would
didn't
1 and 1 stop being 2?
no, I didn't say God would stop thinking about creation. It would be he would stop actively sustaining it.
Okay, but if
Um,
God stopped actively sustaining 1 and 1, would it stop being 2? I'm just trying to
it's
understand.
part of his essential nature to think thought. I mean, God can't stop thinking, having thoughts about
Okay, so
created worlds
if
for
there was
eternity.
no God, would 1 and 1 be 2?
No, there wouldn't be anything. There wouldn't be anything. There would be no 1 + 1 = 2. There would be no propositions or anything. Nothing would exist without God. That's what God's aseity, the doctrine of God's aseity, is all about.
Okay, so I almost got you there. So I will quit pressing here, but I think that the listener kind of understands what I'm getting at. So
Well,
I'm
I
going to
don't. What are you trying to say? What's your point? Because God can stop sustaining creation, that doesn't mean he stopped sustaining a thought about create. That can never go away. He'll for eternity before before creation. The wrong way to say it, but even without creation, he still has thoughts about creation. The proposition about this possible world still existed as an unactualized possible world. It just wasn't.
what I'm challenging is that there are basic things about the universe that exist in the mind of God as real things, and that's why they exist. I will be challenging your entire proposition on numbers when you get to that podcast. Maybe hopefully next week. But the idea that something like numbers is a thing in actuality as opposed to merely a property or even a description uh, of relationships, not in fact real things. And so if it is the way you describe it, then theoretically, if God stopped holding the universe together, then numbers wouldn't exist anymore. And the
Uh,
idea of 1 and 1 equals 2 would be wrong because it's only right because it exists in the mind of God that way. And I am suggesting that that is utter BS.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. Just to clarify, so David is taking in what's called an anti-realist position on numbers or abstract things, and guess what? That's fair enough. I promised it's not obvious that my notion divine conceptualism is true. It is a majority position, and it has been the majority position traditionally in Christianity. I believe it or not, I tend to take the mainstream view on this, and I actually disagree with William Lane Craig, who spent years researching this and just recently put out a book about specifically God's aseity. So William Lane Craig would agree with David here. He's an anti-realist in regards to numbers and that sort of thing, and there are several different positions. I would suggest the audience check out William Lane Craig's presentation of that. But yeah, as for me, no, I take the divine conceptualist route. I am a realist in regards to that. So yeah, we can discuss that. Another thing, God's. I was going to get into God's simplicity, but I had specific things I wanted to mention about that, and I haven't researched it, so I don't know offhand what I wanted to say about it. But there's a sense where God
Just
is.
introduce us to what it means.
So there are different. Again, there are different views, but it's just saying that God is a simple entity. He's not complicated or composed of divisible parts. Like it doesn't make sense to divide God any more than it makes sense to, can there be 50% of a soul or something like that? Yeah, he's not composed of indivisible parts, and that extends to he's not divisible in terms of his attributes either. Like some people have tried to come up with objections based on that. God is simple in that way, but I don't take a traditional Thomistic approach. I think he goes too far in his notions of simplicity. But yeah, I would need to. I'm not prepared to get into details on that since I wanted to research certain things about that. But yeah, that in a nutshell, that's what I mean. God's simple.
So if you slice off any part of God, you would have the whole God.
You cannot slice off a part of God. That's what I'm saying. Like there is no divisible. You can't divide God up into parts or something. Like you can't take a knife and
Right. So he doesn't have arms and legs and cells and corks and things. There's just this one thing that is God.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, that's all I meant.
Okay. Okay. And then what else? So we also have the ones that people are probably familiar with as well, that God is omnipotent. So he is all powerful or able to do everything. He is able to exert control over everything that it is logically possible for him to control. So that's sort of the definition. I mean, the very definition entails logical coherence in it. So I mean, it's going to be pretty hard to dispute that. I don't know. We'll see if David's going to try or what. There's God's omniscience. So here, so again, similarly, God knows all logically possible true propositions. He has knowledge of all true propositions is how I define omniscience. So this means that there's some knowledge that humans can have, for example, that God can't or doesn't have. He doesn't have knowledge of what it's like to be a sinner, or what the quale of what it feels like to be Dale Glover. That's logically impossible for God to know, to have that kind of experiential knowledge. Otherwise, he'd be a schizo. He is everyone, and that sort of, and he has knowledge of what it is to be not God, for example. So that's just logically incoherent and impossible. So there is that qualification on omniscience that includes various forms of knowledge. I'm a monist, so I believe that there are middle knowledge propositions that correspond to God's middle knowledge. And then the last one is Omni Benevolence. God is morally perfect. He is he never sins. He never does what's evil. He always does what is logically necessarily morally good, as defined by his own essential nature. So yeah, I think that's all the attributes, and certain ones of these attributes I'm going to be highlighting later on in an upcoming show, to say that God is what we call a maximally great being. And I'm going to be trying to use an ontological argument to prove that he exists. So, some of these attributes that I'm going on about aren't actually a part of the ontological argument, or aren't necessary for the ontological argument. The immutability is just not a part of it. The impassability is not part of it, or that sort of thing. So yeah, I want to make it clear, my opinions are not obvious on all these things. Some of them are controversial. There is room biblically to disagree on what it means for God to be eternal, for example, or for God to be immutable, that's my take. Those are all the attributes I can think of offhand to talk about.
Okay, so let me dive right into this idea that God, you were talking about God being all powerful, that he could do only those things that are logically possible.
Yeah.
And you use that argument in a few places. And so I wanted to gently push back against that, because I actually don't agree with it. Even as a Christian, I felt uncomfortable with giving God even that kind of limitation, and here's why. There's a lot about Christianity that's not logically possible. And Christians, if they're good at anything, it's living with paradox. Things that are logically not possible, logically not sensible. But we will say, when we have to believe something that's logically nonsensical, we'll just call it a mystery. But when you want to keep God out of trouble, you say, well, he can only do that which is logically possible. So I see that as a double standard. I don't think Christians have any problem ascribing things to God that are not logically possible.
Well, I do, for example, and I know plenty of Christians that do. Maybe some lay Christians are comfortable with doing that, but they are. I have to say they are obviously wrong, and I'm being restrained and careful when I use the word obviously. I do mean it in this case. I do think that if you say God is capable of making 1 + 1 = 8, that is logically incoherent, and you're wrong. Plain and simple. I have no doubt, 0% doubt. I'm 100% knowledgeable that.
And yet he's able to take a piece of fish and some bread and feed 5,000. He can make 1 + 1 = 8 if he wants to. He's able to have a pregnant virgin that's logically incoherent also, and yet that's Christianity. We are fed nonsense about the Trinity, three in one person's nonsense. Go as far down the Trinity rabbit hole you go, and it's just logically impossible. We just have to accept it as a mystery. So I disagree with you that Christians aren't asked to believe things that are logically impossible.
Okay. Okay, so good. So I get where you're coming from. This is something that we've discussed in private. So the laws of nature in the first place are not metaphysically necessary. So yes, certain acts that God does violate the laws of nature, but that's not to say that he's violating laws of logic that are necessary, or mathematical truths which are logically necessary. So that those kind of things aren't really a problem unless you're artificially saying that the laws of nature are metaphysically necessary in some sense, and I don't think you can establish that. I think the majority of scientists would be happy to agree with me. Stephen Hawking would agree with me on that.
Oh, but I hear Christians all the time say it's logically incoherent to talk about a married bachelor.
Correct.
Well,
Yes.
I don't see how that's different than talking about a pregnant virgin. It's just that one of them is a part of Christian lore and the other isn't.
So this gets into semantics then, right? So it depends what you mean by when you spell out what those words mean. Once someone understands what a married bachelor is, they entail a logical contradiction. A pregnant virgin isn't necessarily a logical contradiction.
Well, I respectfully disagree.
Well,
So,
well, then entail, what is it? She is someone who is virgin part. She's never slept with a man, so she's never been in a position to get pregnant through normal natural means. But yet she's pregnant. She is with child through non-natural, ordinary means. So there's different senses. There's no contradiction, right? There's no violation of the law of non-contradiction, because there are different senses that are entailed in terms of these statements, right? Like you're just saying, well, there's only one way to get pregnant, and pregnant means you have to have sex with a man in an ordinary way. And since the virgin's denying that she had sex with a man in an ordinary way, therefore there's a contradiction. Well, I would agree with that, but we would quibble over, well, what does it mean to be pregnant? And there are different ways someone can get pregnant, and that avoids the contradiction. Does that make sense?
Well, I understand your effort there. I reject your effort, but I'll be happy to put a tag of agree to disagree
Okay.
on,
Okay. No,
on that.
that's fair enough. That's a good, and that was a good thoughtful objection. So thank you for that. Um,
But
the other
I would also
thing
say that
about
the
Trinity,
Trinity, that
yeah,
also fits in that category of it's one of those things that the human mind, I still contend this. I don't care how you conceive it. I don't care how you formulate it. It's a heresy by someone's way of thinking. You can't formulate it in a way that's not a heresy. You can't picture it the way Christians like to try to talk about it. It's something that you just have to accept as one of those things that, well, it's a mystery. I don't know how it works. You throw your hands up and you say, well, God can do anything.
yeah. So with the Trinity, I'm not going to get into too much details on this because, as we'll be finding out the next time it's my topic, um, I'm going to be doing the final part of the coherence of Christian theism. And that's going to be on Christian specific doctrines, the Trinity and the Incarnation. Are they logically coherent, and what might it mean? So I'm going to resist the urge to get into details about that, but trust me, they are logically coherent. But yeah, okay, there is an underlying objection here. So David's saying that Christians um, tend to no, there's two objections. So number one, they tend to like mystery. They can't figure it out, and so they just say, "Oh, okay, I don't know what the answer is. I'm just gonna turn off my brain and just be content with I don't know what the answer is." And I think that's fine. I mean, number one, not everyone's as smart. There are things that I can't figure out. I'm not at that level, and I just say, okay, well, I'm just happy pleading ignorance. I don't know yet what the answer is to that, and that should be seen as heroic. I mean, skeptics do that all the time, and they boost themselves up in pride, like, see how humble I am. I don't know the answer to what caused the origin of life. I don't know how the universe started with the Big Bang, or what explains the what caused the universe, or something like that. You're right. You're allowed to say you don't know. And Christians can do that if they aren't privy to an answer that they understand. Then they can just say, "Well, I don't know, but I have faith that there is an answer out there."
Okay. Well,
The
so
second
I
was the
just so you
second.
know, I agree with your sentiment there. I'm not going to be pushing back on that at all. Part of my objection, though, was that Christians are perfectly happy to accept things that seem to be logically incoherent
Yeah,
when it is important to their theology. But when they need to give God some wiggle room, they will say, "Oh yeah, God can't do things that are logically coherent." That's the
mhm,
objection. It's a kind of a hypocrisy objection. Pick one.
sure. Yeah, and I will agree with I will agree with you. I think that Christians that do that are not doing us any favors. That's the wrong position to take, to embrace logical incoherence, to try and get God off the hook or something like that. But there was a second underlying point um, that I've forgotten now, but it's important to. Um, so do you remember what you mentioned two things? So the Christians embrace mystery and incoherence, and there was something else that you said before that. Do you remember?
That was so 4.5 minutes ago.
Yeah, no, it was a good one though. It's
So,
important for me to get that out.
what the audience does not know is that I was having some terrible, terrible knee pain last night. I took a whole tramadol, and because I get the opioid itch, I also took a Benadryl, and that Benadryl was closer to this morning than last night. So yeah, if you're lucky that I can string two thoughts together, remembering what I said 4.5 minutes ago. Roll back the tape, people. I don't have a clue.
Okay. All right. I'll just
I
listen.
am
When I listen
fighting
to
with I've been fighting with one lobe tied behind my back here.
it. Okay. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, when I listen to it, if I remember what that point was, I'll leave it in the comments just so people know. So, all right, cool. So yeah, I'm good on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you ready for my main objection to your coherence argument?
Yes.
Okay. So um, everything I've said so far is just a matter of clarification, except the last thing, which I think is a legitimate objection. But here's why I can't fully interact with this topic. Um, so there are a couple of things going on here for me. I think maybe it's hard for me to think of what the main one is, but I'd say at this moment, I feel like my main objection is that there's simply no way for you or anyone else to know the properties of a God. Unless you invented the God, you simply can't know. And so we are debating something as unknowable as what God's favorite T-shirt is. Um, it's you just can't know. There's no book. I think that I can show that the Bible is not a suitable book to try to figure out God's properties because it's a little bit all over the map here. Um, and unless God is, maybe just whispering in your ear and telling you things a la Natalie Collins style, uh, there's just no way for you to know whether God is immutable or eternal or omnipotent or any of that stuff.
Well, why don't we just ask her and she'll settle the debate once and for all?
If only I could.
Okay. Okay. All right. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Okay.
but
Uh,
and look, I didn't mean any slight against Natalie. I mean this is
no,
Natalie's view uh, about God. God tells her things, and it would be nice if I could meet one of these people who God's talked to, and get some specific questions answered because that would be really helpful.
yeah.
Um, and in this case, I mean, I know that you've got a kind of a house of cards built up as to why you believe these things, but at the end of the day, I'm happy to just nod and say, yeah, that's a nice God you've got there. But you can't possibly know whether this describes God or not.
Yeah. So yeah, and that okay. So there's a fair point in there. So how do Christians ascribe or know about God's attributes and that sort of thing? So there are two main sources, and I think I outlined this in part one, if I remember. But so yeah, in the first place, there's the Bible. There's divine revelation. God reveals to us some of these attributes that I've been discussing here. However, David's wrong to say that they contradict each other. I know he believes that, but I don't believe there's a contradiction in the attributes in the Bible. But it is true that the Bible is underdeterminative in terms of God's attributes. It doesn't give us all these specific details and that sort of thing, that it doesn't go all the way in terms of describing the nature of these attributes and that sort of thing. So yeah, the Bible is divine revelation is supplemented by what's called perfect being theology, and this is another source of knowledge for God's attributes that takes advantage of what the Bible, the raw data that the Bible gives us, and then extrapolates out through logical reasoning and that sort of thing as to, what sort of God, what attributes and to what degree God has these attributes and that sort of thing. So that's what the ontological argument does, right? That's what a maximally great being is. The Bible doesn't describe God as being a maximally great being. This is a part of perfect being theology, which supplements our knowledge based on the raw data in Scripture. And yeah, we put two and two together and that sort of thing. I mean, the Trinity itself, the term the Trinity, this was a concept that came, later on, 220 AD or thereabouts, with Tertullian. But yeah, he's taking the raw data of Scripture and then he's using head canon and that sort of thing to put it together and put a helpful little label on it. And yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with using perfect being theology or philosophy to help us come to grips with and spell out in more detail beyond what the Bible gives us as to what these attributes are and what they entail.
Well, yeah, so I obviously disagree with that, but a way that maybe I could agree with that is if you could make the case that your conclusions about God's properties are necessary conclusions. In other words, no reasonable person could come up with any other possibility. Because if you can come up with some other possibility, then you can't be sure that you're right.
Yeah, but I think yes, that's fine, right? And for the purposes of this show, I'm not trying to argue that my conception of God is true, only that it's coherent. So I don't know that that's really a problem, but it is true that we need to show epistemic humility, because there are some attributes when we get into details and arguing through philosophy or logic as to what does it mean for God to be eternal. The Bible just gives us enough information to conclude God is eternal, but in terms of what sense is he eternal, yeah, you can give arguments back and forth and conclude which one you think is right, but at the end of the day, you should show epistemic humility that some Christians can take this position, whereas others can take this, and it might not be obvious who's right on that front.
Okay, then you don't actually have a property. That's all I'm saying. You've got some interesting speculation. You've got the start of a good fiction novel. I wish you well. Let's see how that goes. But if the only thing you want to do is to show that you can invent a God that's coherent, I just don't think that's that big of an exercise. I can invent a God that's more coherent than the God of the Bible. So you're having to go through a lot of work to make your God coherent. I can do better. So what?
Well, there isn't more coherent. It's either coherent or it's not. So you can invent another concept of God that is coherent.
Let's put it this way. I could invent a God where I wouldn't have to work nearly as hard to make it coherent as what you're having to do. So, once again, if the only thing we're saying is that it doesn't have any internal contradictions, which I obviously think that this God does have plenty of internal contradictions. Just in clarifying some things up front, I think that we've outlined a few potential places where there are internal contradictions. But I can grant you your coherence theory, and you still don't have a God.
Do you mean like, I haven't proved that my particular coherent notion is correct versus another coherent version, right? Like
right.
Yeah, sure.
Like
sure.
I said, I can make a better God. So what?
Yes, you could make a better one in the sense that you said. Like for example, the Bible gives us the Trinity. This is something that takes extra effort.
And my God didn't have any kind of Trinity. You don't have to worry about that.
It's just the Unitarian. Okay.
Yeah.
Of course.
Also, I would not try to make my God perfect. My God is not perfect. Why would a perfect being create me? No, my God is more like me. He has my attributes, only bigger. That explains a lot. That explains why my God is a jealous God who likes revenge. We don't have to think about that. My God doesn't have to be all powerful, but he's really powerful. I mean, he can knock you out.
Sure.
He can do a lot of things. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
Zeus is logically coherent.
Right.
Yeah,
I can solve a lot of the problems that the Christian God has by making a far more, I think, coherent God. All I'm saying, though, is we just have two different starting points of different works of fiction. Why should I care that your God is coherent?
Yeah. Okay. That's a fair point. So I think that's where we need to get into the arguments for the existence of one particular coherent notion of God versus another. That's why the evidence and logical argumentation to favor a traditional concept of God, or the Christian God in particular, is needed, right? I would agree with that point. It depends on whether there's evidence to rule out certain notions of God or that sort of thing versus accepting another one.
Okay. So
and
that was easy.
Audience,
so
we will be getting into one of those arguments, or one of those arguments that I think does prove, at the very least, not necessarily a Christian God, but a what's called a maximally great being. And with the maximally great being, the way the definition, well, I shouldn't get into that now. You'll
actually,
see that.
You should, because that's my second objection. So let me just lay out my second objection, and you can decide whether you want to get into it or not. My second objection is I simply cannot conceive of your God. So if part of your argument, which I know that we're going to get into the ontological argument in the last part, and I'm not trying to force a discussion of that, but in order to understand my objections, I have to skip ahead a little bit. I am incapable of conceiving of the God you describe. And part of your argument with the ontological argument, well, and with modal logic, more specifically, is that we start with what can be logically conceived. And I disagree with you that the things that you have outlined can be logically conceived. Now, let me take a half step back. You can conceive of them. I cannot. I can't draw a picture in my mind of what that would be like. I can't understand it. It just gives me a headache. It does not comport with how I believe the world works, or how people work. And so I can't follow the logic through. So the fact that your God is inconceivable to me, even if he were real, still means that there is no point of contact between he and I.
Okay, so basically then what you're saying is that there is inevitably some logical contradiction that's entailed. So the first thing I want to...
Let me be clear about that. That is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that to me, there is, and I might just be a bad logician. So it could be that there is nothing logically contradictory about your God, but it is contradictory enough to me that I cannot grapple with your God. But that's okay. I don't have to prove that there's ultimately something logically contradictory. I only have to prove that it is beyond my capability.
No, so you need to prove that to you there is a logical contradiction. And then if you're found out that actually that's not a logical contradiction, then that removes that problem. But essentially, whether you want to intellectualize it or not, you're in effect saying that, for example, even though this isn't a part of this show proper, but like the Trinity is, to you, it's logically contradictory or something, or...
Yes.
Okay, so forgetting about the Trinity for a second, because that's not...
There are other things about your God that are logically contradictory, almost everything.
Gotcha. Okay, gotcha.
Once again, to me, so I'm not making a broader claim that I am right, but I can only deal with your God with the capacity that I have. And with the capacity that I have, your God cannot exist.
Okay, so I'm trying to deal with you where you're at, and see if I can get you where you're at to change where you're at.
Good luck with that.
Okay, so in the first place, you kind of answered this, but this was going to be my question. Is it are there contradictions in the individual attributes,
yes.
Or do you think it's how the attributes relate to each other in some way?
Yes.
So both?
Yes.
Okay.
Like I
And
said, I think almost everything about this God is logically contradictory.
okay, okay, so
By the
and
way, this is not
second
me as
question.
skeptic talking. This is part of what I had to come to as a Christian, and just acknowledge the fact that this God that people are talking about doesn't make any sense to me.
Okay, okay, so that's fine. Second question before I try to address anything. Um, Now you hinted at this. Is it what you said? It doesn't make sense the way the world works and what you know about humans or people or something to that effect. You said something
Yes.
like that. So is it primarily the intrinsic attributes of God, or the attributes of God are intrinsically contradictory, or is it merely just that it's extrinsic, like his attributes are contradicting extrinsic facts to him, like the problem of evil is an extrinsic fact that's said to contradict God's omni benevolence or something like that, or is it both? And I'm
It,
getting your answer will be
again, I would have to say it's both.
gotcha. Okay. Okay, so in this show, I'm not necessarily going to address the extrinsic stuff because I see that as separate. We can do a show on the problem of evil, or we've done it quite a lot, or the hiddenness of God, something like that. Let's sort of focus on the intrinsic. So, okay, so you
Okay,
said
but
it's
I don't think it's going to be that easy to separate out. I understand what you're saying, and I kind of halfway agree with you, but I don't. It's not that easy, because when you say God is benevolent, that's an intrinsic characteristic. Um,
yeah,
and you
no,
say
no,
he's
it's
omniscient.
how his attributes relate to an extrinsic fact, and there's a contradiction between the two,
Oh,
right? Like,
okay.
yeah, that's all I meant by that.
All right. Look, I'm trying to stay true to what you're putting out there. So I'm not trying to be an obscurantist here. And
No, no, I think this is good. This will help the audience to understand because what we're talking about here is look, there's the logical incoherence of the concept of God as an argument for atheism, and this is primarily just an intrinsic thing. How does God's attributes make sense in isolation versus how they make sense related to each other. And then there are other arguments for atheism based on that his attributes like omni benevolence and omnipotence are contradictory to extrinsic facts about
okay.
the world.
So let me give you an example of an intrinsic. I think this would be intrinsic
Contradictory.
idea that I can't wrap my mind around.
Okay.
I don't know if it's contradictory or not, but
Okay.
I can't get my mind around it, and I've tried for years. Um, God existing eternally in reverse. So I can wrap my head around forward eternality. I can't wrap my head around backward eternality.
Okay.
So especially with something like intelligence. Now, I I told myself that I wouldn't get into this because I'll get myself in trouble pretty quick. But so let me just give you and the Christian audience something that you can use to beat me up on this week. I actually do believe in material eternality, which is to say,
Retro in reverse.
yes. So I believe that matter and energy in some form has always existed. Um, don't ask me to show my work. I can cite a physicist or two, but then you can cite other physicists, and so I'm not going to get into that battle.
Well, you took away my. I was about to get into retro causation, but I was going to agree with you. I was about to say like, wow, great, but
Yeah.
you have
So
inconsistent standards. It's
I
okay.
did, yes.
Material.
I understand this. This is why I'm handing you a golden platter here. um, I recognize that there might be some inconsistency here. That said, I believe it is much easier for me to wrap my mind around the eternality of material than it is for the eternality of a conscious mind. So, hello, Tara. So
remember, you invited her.
Yeah.
So you'll deal with her in the comments on the conscious.
So if you want to see what it looks like for Tara to turn against me,
This is the one that, yeah.
hello.
Materialism.
So yeah, here's how it works in my mind, so that you can get inside of it a little bit. Matter and energy are just states. You know, they don't have to think or do. They're not conscious of anything. They just are. And so a state sitting around and or changing and morphing over a period of eternity, from eternity to eternity, that doesn't hurt my head quite as much as an intelligence sitting around from the beginning of forever until he decides to do something. So if you say that God is timeless and spaceless, but yet we have time and space, and, you know, let's call it planet heaven, you know, whatever heaven is, because it's a place where people who are bound by time and space can go. We have to imagine the moment before heaven. So what is the universe? Well, it's just God sitting around the great nothing, because there's no vacuum. It's just God. And then, you know, one day after a trillion lifetimes, he says, you know, I'm bored. I got to do something. I've got this sitting around is driving me bonkers. You know, but of course the Christian would say, well, that's not at all what happened. But this is kind of what you almost have to imagine if you imagine a being that was there forever, because you can always ask, well, what was he doing before then? What was he doing before creation? What was he doing before heaven? Well, what was he doing before then? He was just doing nothing or everything, or that makes no sense to me. I cannot wrap my words around it, let alone wrap my mind around it.
Beautiful. I agree 100%, my friend. Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why we can't say God is everlasting in the past. Um, but the same problem applies to materialism as well. Obviously, we can just say, well, what was matter doing before that? What was matter doing before that? I think the only difference that you appeal to is some kind of psychological factor, like, oh, but God, it would be so boring for him to sit and.
Well, that's not the only difference, but that's the one I appealed to then. I would also appeal to a more concrete difference of, we've seen consciousness emerge from matter. We've never seen matter emerge from consciousness. So if you start with consciousness, I would have to wonder, well, how do we get the matter? But if we start with matter, I don't have to wonder how we get the consciousness.
Okay.
So that's a more scientific, more concrete argument that it doesn't do us any good to argue about. But so there is another reason why it makes more sense for matter to be eternal than consciousness. But I am focusing on the more psychological aspect right now.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, in the first place, we can just say, well, God, as a maximum great being, God would never get bored over eternity. I mean, we're going to be existing forever into the future, and we're not going to get bored. So it would be the same issue, but yet you don't have a problem imagining it going forward for eternality. So I would just say,
no, yeah, but it's different though going forward, because going forward we've got lots of people and lots of things and lots of options and stuff going on. But going backwards, there was nothing.
Yeah, but
and so you would kind of have to.
There's three people. But yeah, God isn't dependent. This is related to God being a say, right? God's not dependent on creation to not be. He didn't create because, oh, I'm bored, I need something to do. He just made a free will choice. He could have made a free will choice for no reason at all, or I think he did have a reason. God has to have a reason, but Um, it doesn't necessarily have to be because, oh, he was bored after an infinite amount of prior moments. But
Well,
I
I'm
don't
not
want to
making the
dispute
case
because
that I'm right. I'm not making a claim of truth here. I'm just trying to explain one of the things that I cannot wrap my mind around.
yeah,
Uh,
no,
one of these
but I'm
intrinsic characteristics.
yeah, and I'm just trying. Let me make this clear. I agree with you about this. Like I don't agree that God is everlasting in the past. Um, but I'm just trying to provide you with a way where it could be coherent potentially based on the psychological boredom argument that you raise. Like there is that argument that they would say, but yeah, but God doesn't get bored. He's perfectly self-sufficient and that sort of thing, and happy, with existing alone. But yeah, to get back to the main point, I do agree with you. This is why I think that without creation, God is timeless. Like this is William Lane Craig has been very influential in my life. Obviously, people know about Molinism. There are three main things why I really respect him and look up to him, and he's had an influence on my life with his research. So there's the Molinism thing that everybody knows. There's also his work on time, God's relationship to time, and that sort of thing, which I think he has a very interesting and unique take on. And he spent 13 years researching this question alone. And then the other is his use of logical deductive arguments and that sort of thing. Yeah, for whatever reason, he was the one who influenced me in those three strong ways. So yeah, he's timeless without creation, but then with creation, he's temporal. And I think he's temporal in the same sense that we are. It's a very technical debate. I mean, he's gotten in debates with Hugh Ross, who has a different version and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think God would have to be temporal, um, given that an A theory of time is true about creation, and because otherwise we would have knowledge of certain propositional truths that it would be logically impossible for God to know. He wouldn't know that today is Saturday, April 6th, or something like that. So it depends on what view of time in general you take. If you take a B theory, then okay, we're timeless, therefore God just exists timelessly, and there is no moment to moment, right? So this is an approach. If you want to say God is just timeless and continues to be timeless, the psychological thing is never an issue. He just exists all at once as a four-dimensional block type thing. Um,
Right. That's the one I used to try to take, but that just doesn't make any sense to me because what that is a God who um, has never done anything or had a thought except for what he's doing and thinking right now. This is um, so he all that has occurred is all that has ever occurred for this God.
yeah, he everything. He's having every thought all at the same time.
Right. And always has.
So you think it's logically incoherent to be timeless, to speak of timelessness, just
Well, yes,
in
for
general?
me, for me, because I can't wrap my mind around that concept. I don't that doesn't make any sense to me. That's just making animal noises as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, I can't go there. And if that's the God of the Christian, I'm already out because I can't pretend that makes any sense to me.
Yeah, I agree with you now in a sense. Although I do agree, I do think that there was a phase. I don't know how to say it without using time, but God was timeless without creation. So I do have to defend God's timelessness to some extent. And I guess I would just point out, in terms of the coherence, the majority of scientists disagree with me and you in terms of time now, right? They all take what's called a B. They don't all take it, but the vast majority of them, atheists and skeptics, will take what's called a B theory of time. They view us as being timeless, four-dimensional worms, if you remember from.
Yes.
Um, so you don't see any. Does that, first of all, does that help at all? I don't want to appeal
No,
to authority,
I
but
so yeah,
does it
no,
cause
I'm
any?
familiar with it. I've read enough physics for that. Still doesn't make any sense to me.
Okay,
So
okay. So
this is my limitation in really being able to grasp the material. Um, it's I can't think theoretical enough to make any sense of that. But let's say that
let me
let's say that it is sensible in some way, that it's possible. It
I'm gonna
still is unrelatable. And the
yeah.
thing is, God is supposed to be a relatable being. And so once again, if that's true, and even if it did make sense, it's still not possible for me to relate to this God.
Yeah, and that's why I don't think God isn't timeless with creation. He has to be temporal in order to have relations. I mean, I mean, my goodness, he entered into time as Jesus through the incarnation. Even if you want to take this
Right,
uh,
but even if you say
time.
before creation, I don't
I don't
buy
say
the
before.
well,
Don't be very careful
well,
with without creation because there is no
okay,
before. Before,
yeah, but there is, you see, that's the thing. So I understand where you're going there, and you're not wrong, technically speaking. But I'm trying to help you and the audience understand my limitation in being able to talk about this sensibly.
yeah. So what
So
I'm trying to I'm trying to see. I think okay. Let me try just about timelessness. Forget about God or anything. Like in terms of it's hard for you to understand him having thoughts, right? Because for us, thinking is sequential and all of
right,
this. Okay, so let's think of a computer in the first place. I know it doesn't think, although you probably would believe in artificial intelligence. So
yeah, but
a
it has
computer,
programs that are executed sequentially.
correct, right? Okay, great. So there are simultaneous workings within a computer, for example. So the same could apply to a mind. We could have simultaneous um, knowledge. And you've already explained that, well, you can have knowledge, for example, across distances of space. Okay, so if God's mind, and same with my computer is interacting with you. You're in what, New York or something, right? So it can perform functions with people at spatial distances, and it could also, then we could just take the temporal dimension and okay, it's interacting with facts or something through temporal duration. My computer is processing the fact that David is talking to me on April 6th, and it's also processing the fact that our conversation with Lewis next week. Okay, well, that's just God just extrapolate out everything timelessly. So everything is happening simultaneously um, in this four dimension. He's having all his thoughts.
Yeah, that analogy doesn't work though, because it's not doing it simultaneously. So if you want to
Yeah,
talk about simultaneous computing, you're going to need to be talking about quantum computing, which is still a thing that we're working on and trying to make happen. I suspect that we will, and we've got some, we've got a good start on that. But that's really what you would have to be talking about. Computing right now is a series of instructions that are, by and large, run sequentially. You can say that they're run simultaneously in the sense that you have programs that are multi-threaded,
yeah, and
and
that's
then
what I
you can
was.
have computers that have multi-cores. But no matter how multi-threaded and multi-core it is, at some point there still has to be
Yeah,
a sense where it's running
sequentially.
temporal instructions one after the other. You can't run instruction B before instruction A and end up with result C.
Yeah, yeah. There is no. So I was just giving you the ladder to try and as a start as to what it might mean and the way that physicists and that sort of thing envision it. But obviously there is no analogy because every analogy is in time.
This
Yeah,
is
there's nothing
exactly
like
the problem. So the thing that I was trying to say earlier, and this is kind of one of the things that I tried as a Christian to understand. This is okay. So we're on planet Earth, and our clocks run at a certain rate, and our day cycles last a certain amount of time because the Earth spins at a certain rate, and it revolves and rotates around the sun at a certain rate. And these are the things that these are some of the factors for how time passes for us. However, if you go to Alpha Centauri, and to the third planet there, maybe that's a bigger planet with a different rate of revolution. It takes a lot longer to go around the sun. And so, they might have 28-hour days and years that, are 500 days a year instead of 365. And also speaking of clocks, because it's, different place, maybe different gravitational forces, time might run slower there or faster. But you're still, so you're not in Earth time, but you're still experiencing time. It's just defined differently. So the way I thought about this as a Christian was maybe there's something called heaven time. So you can say that God invented our space-time, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't also inside of some space-time that's just different from ours.
Yeah, so that would be the position of people like Hugh Ross or something, where there's like a hyper dimension of time. The point is there's still temporal sequence, even
Right.
in these hyper
It's still time. It's just not our time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So that I don't appeal to that kind of thing as though it gets us out of the issue. But so I don't know how, if you're just not gonna say it makes sense for something to be timeless. I guess I can't reason through an analogy in from temporal operations that's going to illustrate what it is to be timelessness, because
I can't either.
Process, but it is logically coherent, and it should at least give you pause for thought that the majority of atheist scientists agree with me that this is a coherent notion, and they don't have any problem conceiving of such a thing.
But they're smarter than me. I have no problem saying that. But once again, even if it were coherent, which I acknowledge is possible, it's still not relatable. Have
you read Brian? Well, I don't know if you're actually interested in this, I can make recommendation. Like, I think Brian Greene has.
Yeah, he's one of my favorites.
Okay, so if you already read him, I guess you found him not persuasive.
No, I find him, like I said, he's one of my favorites. I would love to think his thoughts. Can't do it. but I like hearing him talk and seeing him write. But that doesn't mean that, look, I've read Einstein, so what?
Yeah.
Trust me, I'm not about to expound on his theories. But I like physics. I play around at Physics World. I'm not trying to make myself sound smarter than I am. If anything, I am admitting that that's just the wrong arena for me. I understand one in every three words at Physics World. That doesn't mean that I don't like reading it.
Okay, so why don't you do this then? So I respect that you just can't get there, kind of thing. Even after reading, the helpful analogies, the imperfect. Every analogy is like a leaky bucket, right? It can only hold water so long. That's a quote from someone I respect, Houston Smith. But I think that you can at least do this then. Maybe we can do this to progress, because I get that you just aren't capable of imagining or conceiving this, even after listening to credible atheist experts that you respect and that sort of thing. But maybe then I would say, okay, well then you should be agnostic. It's not coherent to you, but you know enough to know that you don't have a right to say that it's not coherent. And then based on that, you'll be open to something like you wouldn't use God's timelessness or eternality as an objection against God to not believe. You would just say, well, I don't know the answer to the eternal thing, but I'm not going to use it as a reason to dismiss the ontological argument or the existence of God. I'm just going to admit defeat. For the moment, I don't know. Maybe God could be timeless. I have no idea. It doesn't make
But
sense to me.
I
But
think I think I've already acknowledged something like that a number of times. I'm not making a truth claim here. I am making a claim about my ability to conceive of it, and
okay.
that is going to play an important role in upcoming arguments about the ontological argument. So
Is this? Let me ask this then, and I'm trying to sincerely dialogue here, so that this will be helpful when we get to the ontological argument and that sort of thing. Is all you're going to be saying is that it's incoherent to me, versus actually being incoherent? Just the yes or no.
I don't know if that's all that I will be saying, but that's all that I'm saying about the temporality of God.
Okay.
I might make a stronger claim, for instance, about the spatiality of God,
Okay.
because I think that is also contradictory, and that I I feel like I've maybe got a better grasp on space than I do of time. And so, that said, I'm no physicist. Then again, neither are you. Um, but if you're telling me that God is fully active and conscious in all locations, and that he has no location, um, but he's everywhere at once. But we're not talking about size. So we're not saying that God is so big that he just encompasses all the space.
Yeah, he's not
Then I
spatially
think that it's just double speak, and you're just doing magic talk.
Yeah, well,
You're just saying a lot of things that are contradictory that without any kind of payoff.
I'm just saying he's causally active. He doesn't need to be present there to be causally active. One of the examples I proved is quantum entanglement goes against our notions of causation. They're at such immense distances. There doesn't need to be a traditional exchange of energy and that sort of thing, or effects can be caused even when there's seemingly no traditional physical interaction that we would typically look at. So that
okay, so if you're saying that God is somehow a bunch of conscious entangled particles, I could go with that, but you're saying that God's not physical. So that's not what you're saying. So I don't think that's a fair analogy. Because I wouldn't have a problem if you said God is a bunch of entangled particles.
Okay, but the entangled particles proves that it's possible to be causally active in a way outside of your traditional understanding of how physical cause and effect takes place.
Well, I don't know that it proves that. I think you're giving too much to entanglement. I don't know that we know how it works. We know that it does work, because we can experiment and adjust the spin on this one and adjust it on that one. So we can see it functionally, but we're a long ways from understanding it.
Right. Okay. But I'm just trying to. It at the very least broadens your horizon. Like if we were 200 years ago, you would not be even open to that. You would probably just say, nope, no, that's not the way it works. It works like billiard balls, boom, 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 like a traditional physicalist understanding.
But for all we know, it does, because we don't actually know what the connective tissue is for those entangled particles.
Okay,
so
correct, and I do take a deterministic view to quantum physics as well. So I'm kind of being a bit of a hypocrite, but I'm just trying to argue for trying to get you to expand your notion of coherence. I'm addressing you as an individual and that sort of thing. And
Right,
look,
but
these
so
quantum this
I understand probably as much as you do about quantum physics, but quantum physics is not magic. So
yeah.
I don't look at it as an excuse to say therefore magic. I see a lot of things that we don't fully understand, and I know enough about it to not
Okay.
rule out the fact that there are the idea that there might be very understandable causative properties going on that make these things work, but we don't have we don't have the tools to be able to look that deeply into it. It's too small, and there's only so far we can look into the world of the super small right now.
Okay. Okay. I can work with even that actually. Okay. So then you would admit it's possible for us to say, look, we just don't know how God is causally active at all points in space. But there could be some reason. Once we figure it out, it'll all make sense.
Well,
Um,
no,
my,
so
my
no, because the difference here is when we're talking about quantum physics, we're still talking about physics. We're still talking about matter and energy. We're talking about material, physical things. When we're talking about God, we're not talking about anything like that. So I don't even know what material we're working with when we're talking about God. But the rules of quantum entanglement can't, we can't apply them to God because that only applies as far as we know to physical things. And we don't know what would apply to God.
okay, so if we don't know what would apply to God, why are we have no business ruling out the fact that he could be causally active in a
Well, but
non-physical
we
way?
also have no reason to believe it. It doesn't make any sense to believe it either. And so I don't believe it. I'm not sure that I am saying it's impossible in a science fiction-y kind of way.
You're just
But
not making it. You're not making a truth claim in this regard. You're just
right,
saying
and you
you
are
can't
making a
envision
truth
how it
claim.
could.
That's the thing. The Christian is making a truth claim, and I am saying, how could you possibly know that? You cannot appeal to quantum entanglement for that claim.
I already said I appeal to things for limited purposes, and I already explained why I was appealing to that, right? So yes, I will admit we don't know on a mechanistic level how this is the problem of interactionism between the soul and the body, for example, right?
Yes.
Apart from just saying, look, it's a direct or immediate cause and effect that takes place. There are no intermediary mechanisms to explain in the first place. So, when you look for that, like you do at the level of physics and that sort of thing, it's a misnomer in the first place. Um, but I'm just trying to say, like, if you as a person, that's the level you want me to address you on it. If
Yes.
you know enough to know that, look, I just don't know enough to rule out these things, then you are saying, look, I can't rule out this as being logically contradictory, a non-physical substance causing a physical effect. I can't make a claim that that is logically incoherent. Then that's good enough for me. Like I would just say, like, okay, I get that it's logically incoherent to you, but just ignore that, like the Christians do. Just say, well, that it's a mystery because I know enough to know that what I think is logically incoherent is not good enough to make a conclusion that it is in fact logically incoherent, and
Okay,
that'll
but
remove this
I
objection.
don't live my life that way though, by accepting things that I cannot prove as just mysteries. I don't have any reason to believe the claim, and I think that this part you're not addressing. I'm not making the claim. You're making the claim that this is God's attribute. I am saying you have no way of knowing that, and you have given me no reason to believe that. And what I understand about the universe doesn't work that way. And what I understand about your claim, you're not even making claims that I can really analogize with what I know about the universe because we're not even talking about matter anymore. So,
Right.
if what you are saying is true, you have no way of showing it. I have no way of validating it. and I have no reason to believe it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that's where you need to address the evidences and that sort of thing. Um, but yeah, to show that something is coherent versus incoherent, there needs to be a logical contradiction that's entailed once we properly understand the concepts that are involved and that sort of thing, right? So that's what I'm trying to get you to see, is that you don't have an actual provable contradiction. So therefore you should be open to the fact that it could be coherent. And then
Okay.
that'll make you open to the ontological argument.
Well, here's where I've got to show some of my frustration, because this is kind of how these arguments on this type of subject go. I mean, the Christian makes claims, person says that's not how the universe works as far as I understand it, and then the Christian starts appealing to quantum physics. And my belief is and has been that once the Christian starts appealing to quantum physics, they have lost the argument. Just stop it, because now what you're really saying is, well, anything's possible. There's no such thing as something that's contradictory. You can't prove that there's anything that's contradictory, because somewhere in the quantum physics, quantum foam, oatmeal cookie cutter kind of way, everything's possible. And I have no patience for that kind of argument, no use for it at all. It doesn't get us anywhere. It just kind of gets you off the hook temporarily, because you know that the person you're talking to doesn't know that much about quantum physics, because nobody does. And so it's just kind of a get out of jail free card for a bad argument.
Okay, so David, let's try a different approach then, because this is frustrating you or whatever. So do you believe in anything, that something is coherent, but not? Do you believe in anything that is logically coherent to you, but that doesn't actually exist in the universe?
Something that's logically coherent to me that doesn't exist in the universe. Okay. Yeah, I think I know where you're going here. So I don't think I wouldn't put it that way. So I don't know. Maybe if we talked for another 2 hours, we can come up with something. I think in the past we've successfully used the example of unicorns.
Sure.
And I've explained why I wouldn't say that unicorns are logically coherent, and why you would. And so, just to help the audience understand the difference between how we look at this, you look at horses and you say, okay, we've got horses. And you look at horned creatures and say, well, okay, we've got horned creatures. And yeah, we've got creatures with single horns, like a rhino. So, okay, we got single horned creatures. And you look at wings and you say, well, we got creatures with wings, large animals like an ostrich have got wings. So you just put it all together and remix those facts, and boom, unicorns, logical. And I would look at that and say, no, it's not. There's not one part of that process that you've gone through in your mind that makes that logically possible. There might be a very good reason why we have never seen a unicorn here, and why it is utterly impossible for a unicorn to exist in the universe. And you can't just take a bunch of facts and remix them and say, well, so any kind of way we remix this is logically possible. I don't buy that for a moment. You have not met your burden of proof that that is a possible thing, just because individual elements of a thing exist. So I do not look at it that way. And I do not think in terms of, well, this thing that I imagine in my mind is logically possible. I don't know if it's logically possible or not. And neither do you.
Yes, I do. Yeah, I'm appealing to your own modal evaluating faculties, and that's what those examples are meant to evoke. And I mean, I don't even need to say it's just logically possible. I think it's physically possible, given our laws of nature and everything in reality. I mean, I don't know why you would. Why is it impossible to envision a horse with a horn on its head? What physically rules that out from possibly coming into effect?
I don't have to know the answer to that. So once again, this is one of the differences between how we evaluate truth claims. I don't need to know why it's not possible. I am not saying it's not possible. I am saying that we don't have any right to say that it is possible. We don't know. Just because you can imagine it doesn't mean that it's possible. There may be a good reason why it's not possible.
Okay. So yeah, I just got to appeal to the it it's ultimately coming down to the fact, yeah, I think our modal evaluating faculties have been proven to be generally reliable, to the sense where we can trust them to
Well, our
meet
modal
our
evaluating faculties gets us gods that throw lightning bolts.
that's a coherent concept. Zeus is coherent, right? You
Okay.
established that
So
earlier in the show.
I don't really have any any use for your modal evaluating faculties if
Yeah.
what you give me is Zeus. So,
Well, do you think Zeus is logically incoherent? He may
yes.
not exist.
Yeah,
But
I actually think that Zeus is logically incoherent, probably slightly less logically incoherent than the Christian God.
okay.
But I actually think that all gods, as I have heard and understand God stories, are incoherent. I have never heard one that I thought to myself, that one's possible.
Okay. So yeah, then I don't see progress being made then, because the way the rejection is just, yeah, it is
Well, but don't
it
talk
is
about
foolish.
rejection.
It
It's
lacks
your
real.
acceptance of things that you can't prove.
Val would agree with me about that. He doesn't agree with the terminology I use, but he would agree with the way I'm proving conceivability.
Okay, but
Um,
Val's
this
not on
is
the show.
No, no, but I'm just, I know that you respect him and that sort of thing.
I
So like,
do.
maybe as a thought, why would he agree with that wacko Christian Dale, on this? So this is a way, but when we get to the ontological argument, I told you I'm going to have a curveball. I'm
Good.
not necessarily just going to be appealing to modal evaluating faculties. I'm going to see if
Okay.
there's something I can do to wiggle you, into accepting that first premise of the argument.
I would like to see that. So if you can do better with the ontological argument than the many people who have tried and failed, I might add,
Yeah.
that would be worth calling in the press for. I don't think that you're gonna do it, but I love the fact that you're going to give me something that I haven't thought about or encountered with
I'm gonna
it. But
try.
I think the ontological argument is such a failed argument that even uh, even some of the great thinkers have had to reject it, and the fact that it's had to be rejiggered and repaired so much over time is an indication that there's something wrong with it. Because if it was that good of an argument, you wouldn't have to keep fixing it.
Well, yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. I won't respond to that. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah. Well, that'll be an interesting show on the ontological argument. For the purposes, I'll stop addressing David and just sort of. I think we've gotten to the end here, but just for the sake of the audience, I'll just appeal to you guys. Do you think you can conceive of something that's logically coherent that doesn't actually exist? I think that our modal evaluating faculties do allow us to do this. It's logically coherent that Dale put on a red shirt on April 6th at 11 a.m., as opposed to a blue shirt, on April 6th at 11 a.m.
And I would say
Oh,
the audience has no idea whether that's logically coherent or not because they don't even know whether Dale had a red and a blue shirt at the time, or whether Dale could have afforded a red or and blue shirt at the same time in his closet. There are all kinds of things that would make that not possible that the audience doesn't have access to. I like the discussion question though.
yeah.
So if
And
guys, if you have listened this far, please take Dale up on his question. Let me restate it to make sure I understand it. Do you think that a thing is logically possible that does not exist in any universe at this time? Its existence is not the issue. It's whether it's logically possible. I think that's a good question, but I would like to add my own question to that, which is, do you think that you can know for certain what is logically possible. So I think
or
that
even know on a balance of probabilities. Let's make it a weaker claim. See what people think.
okay, because I think the pushback that I've been giving you right now is we don't know what's logically possible, and we can't determine what's logically possible just because you have a fertile imagination and you can imagine things that you think make sense. What we think makes sense is not what determines what's possible.
So are you only objecting to my use of modal evaluating faculties when I use it in the 100% degree of knowledge? Like if I said I was 99%, you'd be like, okay, that's cool.
I think that would be cooler.
That
Yeah.
I don't necessarily claim it has to be 100%. It could be 51% based on your modal evaluating faculties.
Okay, so
Yeah,
you're just well, if what you're saying is you're just taking your best guess about what's logically possible, then great. I take my best guesses about what's possible too, but I don't take that as a way of saying, therefore, it is in fact logically possible. An example of something that I don't know and I speculate on, and I go back and forth depending on the day. So ask me today, I'll give you one answer. Ask me tomorrow, I'll give you another. Are there aliens with human-like intelligence or greater, humanoid style sentient alien beings? It's a fun question to debate at night when you're half drunk. But the fact of the matter is, no matter what powers you bring to bear on that subject, you do not know whether it is possible or not.
okay, so let me rephrase the question then to what I'm actually trying to ask. The question for the audience is: Do you believe that you can have 50.01% or more knowledge that something is logically coherent, i.e., logically possible? It means the same thing, but does not actually obtain or exist in the actual universe. And I gave the example of my red versus blue shirt. David exposed sort of a difference in what we mean by logically coherent, because he's saying, well, maybe you can't afford a blue shirt. That doesn't matter. It's still coherent that I could have afforded it and worn a red shirt or something like that. So those factual distinctions don't speak to strict logical coherence.
It does. You just need to add more factual distinctions. There may not have been any red shirts in your size in the world on the day that you were buying shirts. It may simply not have been possible for you to own a red shirt. You're just not taking enough of those factors into consideration.
No, I think you are not. I mean, it's logically possible I could afford, or there was a shirt in my size. I mean, there's a possible world where there was a shirt.
But you were asking us specifically, could it have happened on that day that you picked a red one instead of a blue one? And I'm saying we don't have enough information to know whether you could have.
In the actual world, perhaps. Yeah, that's a question. I'm not asking you to say, can you know if I'm actually wearing one or not? Where those factual considerations would be relevant. I'm just saying there's a logical possible world, because it's logically coherent that I could have had the proper money. I could have had all of the qualification or secondary facts that go into that could have obtained to make it possible that I was wearing a red shirt on April 6th at 11 a.m. as I talked to David about this. But yeah, okay, we disagree. That's great. Let's see what the audience, what they think.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's right. So you can also ask, is there a world where the cosmological constant is different so that, we're
Yep.
15 feet tall instead of, 5'10", sort of thing. I mean, it's kind of an exercise of can you just, is anything possible? and I don't believe that anything is possible. And I think that when you're talking about logical possibilities, you have to be more constrained than just thinking in terms of, any kind of fanciful thing you can imagine is possible. Because, like, once again, I can come up with a science fiction-y kind of explanation to make almost anything possible. And so, if that's your standard, then I don't even see why we're bothering with modal logic at all. Just say that you think that anything's possible and therefore anything's probable. And that's, I don't see how we get past that debate, because we're just limited only by your imagination.
No, but anything, just because anything's possible, which is true, does not mean that anything's probable.
Okay, but I don't think it's true. But whether it is true or not, there's no way for you to suggest it's true.
Well, I've just given one. I've taken away. Forget about unicorns or supernatural things. A lot of the skeptics will have just an anti-supernatural bias and automatically go against that because they think only the laws of what is consistent with the laws of physics is logically possible. So, okay, I don't care at this point. Let's just start with. I mean, my God, my goodness. I'm sorry to use. You're saying that it's logically incoherent that Dale is wearing a white shirt on April 6th at 11 a.m. And you want people. I'm sorry, this is just, yeah. As a technical terminology, this comes across as skeptical to the point of foolishness. By the way, I am wearing a white shirt, so if I'm not going to trap you into saying, well, no, I don't know if that's coherent or not. It is. I'm wearing it right now. So, yeah, I just want people to think of that one example. There's no it's consistent with the laws of nature. If you're going to use your modal evaluating faculties to pronounce, yeah, that's logically coherent, that's what I'm doing, and that's what I suggest is at the very least, a generally reliable way of coming to modal knowledge.
I agree with the use of modal knowledge in the way that you use it, though, to determine whether or not there is a God. And when we get to the ontological argument, I would just say that modal logic is a bad tool, kind of like Bayes is a bad tool for trying to do the sorts of things that you do with that. So I'm not a huge fan of modal logic anyway, and I think that its uses are specific and limited. And I think that a lot of Christians, including yourself, find it useful because it's a way that you can sneak in the concept of anything being possible, and then giving your God a higher probability than he actually would get.
Fair enough. All right, cool. Yeah, I'll let you have the last word because I initiated this week. So,
Okay.
yeah, I think there was some good stuff for people to think about in there. So,
Let's be honest. This show stunk. I apologize to the audience. This it's like a crappy
are you serious?
show.
Or
Kind of. We didn't do well. We didn't argue nearly enough. Everything that I said this week was completely sincere.
yeah. Well, that to me, that's when it's a good show. Like I was trying to be very careful and trying to interact with you. Like I was sincerely trying to.
I was also
They're good.
trying to give you a fair conversation about a thing that you know full well, A, I don't care about, and B, I'm not well versed on.
Okay.
So
Like you're not happy unless it's polemical. That's your cup of tea.
no, not really. I'm not happy pontificating about things that I don't know a great deal about.
Gotcha.
So, because of the nature of the way we have this set up, I kind of have to give an honest attempt at a conversation. This is the best honest attempt that I can get. But I recognize that I don't have a philosophy degree. You don't either, by the way. But
Right.
I have to talk in a way as if I had more authority and knowledge on a subject than I do. Otherwise, we could have ended this show right at the beginning and said, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I enjoyed the conversation. I like the sincere trying our best to attempt and give the best of both sides and trying to see if we can make progress. So yeah.
So audience, second discussion question. Did this show suck as much as I think it did?
They'll just say yes, no matter what. You said it. It's got to be true.
No, it doesn't. Like, I owe you an apology, listeners. We're going to make it up to you next week. Who do we have on deck?
All right, we have a special guest that I've brought on board. He's Louis Dizon is coming on. He was my own personal adult Sunday school teacher. He's going for his PhD right now in ancient Near Eastern languages at U of T. So yeah, we've got about 5 different discussion topics about him. He's quite interesting.
Yes, but tell them why he's interesting. Don't bury the lead.
Okay, if you want me to hint at it. So yeah, one of the topics that we're going to be addressing is something we've never discussed fully here, but it's differences between Catholicism and Protestantism. So Louis, he was quite the little reformed, Reformed Baptist person. He was known as the next James White in apologetic circles. And recently, just as of last November, he was going through a period of about 2 years of struggling with Catholics on various doctrines and that sort of thing. And he announced that he has got converted to Catholicism and rejected Protestantism and that sort of thing. So that's going to be one of the topics we're going to be discussing about. He's given about 4 to 5 reasons for his conversion. But yeah, there's going to be other stuff. There's going to be questions about morality of the Old Testament that I know David's going to enjoy, and Tara's going to like that and all that. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of good stuff on that show.
Yeah, it's going to be a good show. Consider it a makeup show. My apology to you, the listener, for this week.
I don't apologize. I enjoyed the show.